Welcome to Managing Conflict, Escalation, and Legal Matters, Practical Strategies for Maintaining Civility Under Pressure. I am Lori Cripp-Martin, a certified family law specialist and the former vice chair for the litigation section for the Beverly Hills Bar Association. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this morning, Ryan Lati. Dr. Ryan Lati is a strategic advisor to boards and executive teams working in high-stakes environments where leadership, decision-making, and conflict affect outcomes. He partners with CEOs, board members, and senior leaders during periods of risk, transition, and uncertainty to improve judgment, alignment, and overall effectiveness. As an industrial organizational psychologist, Dr. Lati focuses on behavioral and interpersonal dynamics that drive or derail outcomes in complex, high-pressure situations. He has advised Fortune 500 and middle market companies globally across more than 20 industries and serves as a board member for both nonprofit and profit organizations. And now let's get started. Dr. Lati?
Well, thank you and good morning, all. I appreciate you having me. As you mentioned, my background is working with executives, board members, as well as attorneys in high-stakes situations where conflict directly affects outcomes. So I'm going to share my screen with you just so you can get a better sense of what we're going to cover. So let's dig in a little bit more. In legal matters, escalation often happens. So that can happen in a variety of scenarios, a variety of situations. But what we want to try to help you do is understand how escalation develops so that you can intervene at the appropriate time so it is still working for you rather than against you. So where does this often show up? These are just some examples. It's not an exhaustive list. These are just examples. In litigation, since you are attorneys, that's not just related to the legal case itself, but how that occurs or transpires or unfolds around it. It happens in negotiations where an early tone or positioning can shape or directly shape outcomes. It can happen in client interactions where there might be misalignment around expectations about risk tolerance as well as around strategy. It can also happen inside your own organization or your client's organization, whether that's within a certain team, leadership team, or across functions, especially when it relates to priorities or determining what the priorities are. So I'm going to ask you guys, I'd be curious to see or hear from you, what are you actually seeing in your world? So as you think about your own work, where do you see this type of escalation show up most often? You could put it into the Q&A section, it'd be great. And unfortunately, I cannot see that. Suzanne, can you call that out if you see it? Because I'm not being able to see it.
Like someone says here with insurance defense counsel.
Okay, there we go. Now it's coming up. Great. All right. Any others? Insurance defense counsel. What are some other areas where you see this show up? Settling audits, clients. Okay. Any others?
Clients.
Micromanagers. Okay. How about one more? No others? Okay. Well, it's clear that you're seeing it show up in a variety of places as well in your day-to-day. And that's kind of the point. It often happens a lot faster than we think it does, and it's often happening before it's visible. So why does it matter? Well, when you're dealing with escalation, thinking changes as well as decision-making and judgment changes and communication as well. So when you see escalation or when you're experiencing escalation or a part of it, the judgment often tightens. The communication becomes less flexible. It often, as far as options and discussions about what could be done versus not done, that tends to decrease, as does the attention focused on the complication of the scenario and any context and surroundings as well. Positions also tend to stiffen or become more rigid. So when that happens, it becomes much harder to explore options. It becomes much harder to adjust strategy, and it becomes much harder to find resolution. And probably the other thing to keep in mind here, and probably the critical one, is that it often can impact well beyond the immediate matter or the immediate issue. So what I mean by that is that it can often affect the relationship. So in some cases, the client might start to lose confidence, not necessarily in the legal soundness, but in how that situation is handled. It can often affect reputation as well as future interactions. So that's why we want to try to identify it faster so that we can intervene sooner. So I just showed you why it matters. So what does that turn into in terms of costs? Well, some obvious ones here. You have unnecessary litigation costs. And granted, if there is more time being spent, that's more billable hours. But the question becomes, is that the right time spent, or is that a result of inefficiency and escalation versus strategy? And if you have more rework, you have extended cycle time, you have more back and forth, so it's not efficient. Secondly, it can also weaken any leverage you have in settlements. It can reduce the paths that you have to determine the best outcome. The more escalation there occurs, the tighter things become. Things that may have been seen viable up front or early on often tend to fade or dissipate as the escalation continues. And of course, risk increases. It'll expand. As I mentioned a moment ago, when it extends beyond the immediate issue, so does risk. So there's one distinction I want to make, and I want to help you reframe how you think about conflict. Often when people hear the word conflict, it has a negative connotation. And that's especially in a US, North American, or Western culture, that is the case because conflict is often associated with war. The conflict in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, and that can be the case. But the one thing I want to help you step back from is if you look at what truly underlies conflict, fundamentally, conflict really is not a problem. Conflict is simply a difference. That's all it is. It's a difference in perspective, difference in priority, difference in how things are being interpreted. So it is just information that there is misalignment, and that information can be very beneficial, and you can help you to determine, what is important to the other side. It can help you to determine what is being understood. It can also help you to determine where there are potential gaps. So the presence of conflict is not the issue. How that misunderstanding related to those differences are handled is what leads to escalation. That's the issue that we're wanting to focus on. So when conflict occurs or escalation occurs, it typically follows a progression or a pathway. So you see 3 points there: signal, flashpoint, detonator. So as you get a better understanding of the pathway, it becomes easier to recognize where you are in that pathway, and easier to recognize where are the places where you can intervene and how to intervene. So the fact that it is a progression should not deter you. It actually is something that can help you. So we will spend some time looking at this progression from a legal context so you can see the various points and what to do at each point. So let's first start with signal. Signal is basically where conflict starts. And it is different. It is not escalation. Oftentimes people think that when conflict begins, that it's problematic, and it's not for the reasons I just mentioned a moment ago. What signal is it's simply a difference. It's a neutral indicator of a difference. As I mentioned before, conflict in and of itself is not necessarily good or bad. It initially has a negative connotation, but if you look at what it really is, it's basically neutral. So signal is a neutral indicator that there is a difference. And that difference could be in how people are making assumptions, how they are looking at outcomes, difference in terms of legal approaches, different interpretations of risk, and how they're seeing facts. So those differences can be very beneficial because having a variety of different viewpoints can improve the decision-making process and actually make the decisions more rigorous because you've taken to a variety of perspectives before you came to the final conclusion. So signal is a very good thing. So as far as signal at this point in the pathway, this is the point where you have the most leverage. And when I mean leverage I'm referring to here is you have a better chance of keeping that escalation so that it is on a positive track and being productive for you versus moving to more of the unproductive side or potentially destructive side. So signal is where it starts. Signal is neutral, and signal is simply just an indicator. Flashpoint. So in signal, you have the issue is there's a difference. Flashpoint has now moved to something else. It's no longer about the difference. It is about how the difference or differences are being handled. So the issue has moved from the difference to the interaction. And what you'll notice is that there is a shift when this occurs. So it'll shift from analysis to advocating for a particular position or viewpoint. The language that you hear people use will also shift to something that is more absolute or more pointed. You also notice that positions tend to become much more set in place. And then you will also notice, because of what I just mentioned, there's tension. And that tension is noticeable or visible. In many cases, you'll be able to pick it up in the voice, you'll be able to notice it in their behavior. Tension is noticeable or visible in some way. That's the distinction here. A shift has occurred and there is tension. The one thing to keep in mind here, if you're talking about leverage, you still have leverage here. You had more at the signal stage. Here you still have leverage. However, that leverage is narrowing and it's becoming time sensitive. Detonator. So detonator is where that escalation has crossed the threshold. It has started to become unproductive or in some cases destructive. So what you're doing here, what you're looking for, or what you'll notice is that those positions that before in the flashpoint stage were starting to become more rigid or more set, now they've become almost impossible to move because they're entrenched. And before with the threshold, the language was becoming more absolute and pointed. Now the language has become more personal and adversarial. The focus also shifts here when you're at this point. It has changed from trying to resolve the issue to winning the exchange. So that means that you're at a point where more often than not, the impact is extending beyond the immediate matter. So when I was talking about before earlier, where you might have it affecting the relationship, where the client might start feeling less confident, not necessarily about the legal standing, but more about how things are unfolding, that's happening. It is also starting to impact how future interactions, and again, the reputation, as I mentioned earlier. As this occurs, you'll notice that the stakeholders often will get more polarized and that trust erodes. So at this point, you are no longer shaping outcome, you are managing consequences. So this is exactly why you want to try to intervene earlier rather than later. You want to try to avoid this particular part in the pathway as much as you can. So let me give you a scenario here. Walk you through really quick. So opposing counsel have differing perspectives or positions on a claim and the strength of it and how it should be addressed. Over a series of emails, their tone back and forth has become more sharper, much more sharp, more direct. At some point, one of the emails questions the position in a more pointed and more accusatory way. The response is sent, but in this case, they're broadening the audience. They're including multiple individuals, multiple parties, and the tone has elevated. So with that scenario, my question to you, and again, please put it into the Q&A section, is where did this become harder to recover? Give you a minute or so to respond in the Q&A section. Any thoughts? So it's like someone said copying parties, and second person agreed, copying parties. Someone else is saying hurt the other party not to resolve when the matter became accusatory. So let's use the progression here, the pathway. So if you look at one more sharply accusatory tone, emails instead of phone calls. Okay, sorry. Great. If we look at the progression here, starting out, so you have differing positions on the strength of a claim. That, as you recall, differences, that is the signal. You still have leverage here. That's the signal. You then have an email where the question positions in more pointed accusatory terms. That's the flashpoint because there's been a shift. You have that accusatory terms. It's much more pointed. And then you have the response, which is copying multiple parties, escalated tone. That's a detonator. So as far as where it becomes harder to recover, it's really at that flashpoint where the shift was. The positions are question becomes more pointed in accusatory terms. That's where it becomes more difficult. You still have leverage, as I mentioned before, but the leverage is much more narrow and it is time sensitive. So keep in mind what I mentioned earlier. We want to try to find a place where you can intervene sooner because that will help you. And one way to do that is to look for tripwires. Tripwires are simply early warning indicators that things are starting to escalate. That's different from a signal. A signal is a neutral indicator that there is a difference. Tripwire is an early warning indicator that the way the difference is starting to be handled is becoming a problem or potentially becoming a problem. So escalation is starting. So what are examples of that, or what you can notice is that listening often tends to reduce or decrease substantially. You'll often notice that people are engaging less. And when they do so, they're often just repeating their position over and over and over and over. So just recycling it without any engagement. The tone has become more sharp, more direct, and the focus has moved from the issue to the individual or to the person. So tripwires are beneficial to you. It helps you find a point where you intervene earlier or sooner, but you still have leverage. So again, we want to catch earlier in the pathway so you have an opportunity to take action before it gets more consequential, more serious, and potentially to a detonator stage. So tripwires are things can definitely help with that. So what do you do when you have all these things? How do you approach them? How do you address the point in the pathway that you're at? Well, it depends on what you're dealing with. So if you are at a signal stage, keep in mind that's where you have the most leverage. So you're wanting to maintain that leverage or preserve it. So you don't need to have a major intervention here. It's just to be aware of what's going on. And in this case, something as simple as saying, okay, uh, what are the potential assumptions that we're making, or what are the assumptions that you are making? So you're kind of exploring, you're identifying where there are differences. And another example would be, well, help me understand how you're viewing this, or how your viewpoint might be slightly different from what I'm seeing. So again, you want to preserve that leverage. If you're dealing with a tripwire, again, you're not a major point of intervention, or doesn't require a major intervention. At this point, you're just wanting to maintain and keep things on track. So you're kind of guiding and steering so that the escalation that is starting to happen is still staying more in the productive range and not shifting over into the unproductive range. So in this case, it might be as something as simple as, hey, let's slow things down a little bit, or let's make sure we're focusing on the issue. Again, doesn't require anything major. It's more just a guide or steering. If you're dealing with a flashpoint, remember, this is where you have that shift. This is where there is tension, noticeable or visible or both. This is where, if it is not handled correctly, it can easily go sideways on you. So in this case, you want to try to do something to focus it on, or change the direction, or focus it on what the outcome is. So it could be something as simple as, hey, let's take a step back. Let's reorient to what we're wanting to accomplish here. Or what is it that you're seeing that is that we're wanting to kind of get to as an endpoint here? Again, you want to get it focused on outcome and not on the fact that there is more heat or more tension. You want to try to move it away from that. So the difference between how you handle tripwire versus a flashpoint. With a tripwire, if you want to use an analogy of a steering wheel, tripwire, you're just steering or guiding. The flashpoint, you're actually turning the wheel because you want to move direction or change direction. What about if you are at a detonator? Then what do? Detonator, you've crossed that threshold. Escalation is continuing and continuing in an unproductive way. So at this point, you want to contain. So you're wanting to stop escalation if possible. You want to try to depersonalize it, and if need be, you want to buy some time. So it could be, hey, let's. I think it'd be more productive if we took a step back and reset the conversation, or let's pause for a moment and come back to this at a later point in time. The whole idea here is you want to try to prevent the escalation from continuing. You want to try to stop it if at all possible. You want to try to make it less volatile by not making it about an individual. So let's look at another scenario here. In this case, it's a client counsel scenario. So the client and counsel have opposing or views that are not in sync, and they're trying to determine, well, how aggressively should we go after this particular situation? We know what the risks are. How important is it that we go after them in a particular way? Over time, the client's impatience sets in, and it noticeably is starting to withdraw or engage less. During conversation, the client actually decides to be a little more assertive, challenges the strategy, and pushes more for a more aggressive approach. And the response of counsel is defensive. So the question to you is, where was the most leverage in this situation? That's question number one. Question number two is, where's the tripwire? So if you wouldn't mind taking a minute, put it into the Q&A section. Curious to see what you have to say. Okay, when they had different views on how aggressive strategy should be. So is that, I assume that's the answer to question one. That's where the most leverage. Okay. Any other thoughts? Expectation answer to both questions. Okay. Tripwire is where the client challenges the attorney, is insulting. Question one, client counsel discussion. Question two, strategy difference. And then we have tripwire, the response becomes defensive. All right, so let's map it out. So if we're looking for the signal here, remember signal's a difference. So the differing views and how aggressively to pursue the matter, that's the signal, simply a difference. If we're looking for where do we start to see escalation start to happen, remember what the tripwire is, and that's where it's starting to happen. You remember some of the examples were engagement decreases. You have, in this case, impatience and engagement. So there's your tripwire. And then you have the client challenging the strategy, pushing for a more aggressive approach. There's a shift. So you have a shift in tone. It's aggressive now. That's a shift. That is the flashpoint. And then as far as the response becoming defensive, that's a detonator. So where do you have the most leverage? As we talked about a minute ago, you have the most leverage early on. So at the signal stage, which would be the differing views. As you progress up the pathway, going to tripwire, which is the impatience and decreasing engagement, you have less leverage. Still have it, but it's less. As you move to the flashpoint, which is where the client is challenging the strategy and pushing for the more aggressive approach, still have leverage, but even less than you do at the tripwire. And it has become much more narrow and much more time sensitive because of the tension that is apparent now. Seeing a couple comments here. Response should seek to understand the client's perspective and ask for clarification. Absolutely. At that point, the client and attorney cannot agree on strategies. I, as counsel, walk away because like this, we kind of have a risky client. Great point. So that could be moving into the detonator stage. So let's stay on the detonator for just a second. So the counsel becomes defensive. So why is that? Why is that a detonator? How did it move into that section? The counsel didn't keep it on step back to kind of redirect sooner or faster. That was an opportunity for them to do so. They could have done it right at the stage where it was the flashpoint, taken that suggestion we had a moment ago of, okay, let's take a step back. What do we want to accomplish here? What's your ultimate outcome? Instead, they let the personal affect them personal. The aggressive approach, kind of the adversarial approach affect them. So again, point of using this scenario, this pathway is to identify where you are and how you can intervene sooner. So let's move forward a little bit here. So what are some common errors that people make when they're dealing with this pathway and trying to navigate it effectively? Well, when you're dealing with escalation, escalation is often a result of speed. So if somebody responds immediately, it often is not deliberate, it is a reaction. And that can lead to escalation because they aren't managing their stuff, in quotes, as well as they possibly could be. The second one, matching tone instead of managing it, related to some degree what I was mentioning a minute ago. So if you have escalation, you have heat in the conversation and interaction, and you add more heat, what typically happens when you add heat to heat, it gets worse. So it often goes sideways, and you're very quickly going to get to a detonator stage. Expanding the audience mid-escalation. So talk about this for a second. So if you're in a multi or a one-on-one thread, email or Slack or whatever device or medium you're using, it's one-on-one, and you add more people to the mix here, that changes the dynamics. It also changes the behavior. Now, doing that early on can be a good thing. So if you were doing that at the signal stage, where it's just about a difference, adding someone else or a few other folks to that at that stage can kind of drive home seriousness. It can also help to get the decision maker involved, which can encourage accountability. So early on, that can be a good thing. That can be a good strategy. However, if escalation is already occurring, and in this case, mid-escalation, so you're at the flashpoint here, you got tension, and you just added more people to that, you are more than likely have made it performative. So now the individuals have an audience, and they're likely to play to the audience. So positions are likely to harden. It's going to be more difficult to go back and forth or move people off those positions and to find a more mutually beneficial outcome. So last one, arguing positions. So anytime you're defending a position instead of exploring options, that's more than likely going to get you closer to a detonator stage very quickly. So have you put a comment in the chat? There's been no effective communication between the parties or meeting of minds and the substantive needs of the client. Attorneys serve clients, even if attorneys have superior knowledge and retained without expertise. That comes to trust you will not be able to. Yep, very, very great point. Contributing real value to client moral will be received. Absolutely. So common mistakes, again, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the ones that typically occur and that I've seen not just in a legal scenario, but also in boardrooms and executive team meetings as well. So let's switch to a different scenario. Same pathway, different scenario. So you have differing views on what's acceptable in a potential settlement, and valuation included. Things are starting to slow down. Positions are reiterated. People are also slower to respond. A new demand is put into the mix, and it shifts the tone of the negotiation, and then ultimately ends up with an ultimatum: take it or leave it. So how could you intervene at the flashpoint? What are your thoughts? Please put it into the Q&A area. So I got a question. What do you think of the use of humor in a professional to de-escalate, and at what stages? Humor can be a very good thing. It depends on what the humor is targeted at. So humor can be a double-edged sword, especially if there's sarcasm in it, because sarcasm is easy to misinterpret. If it is self-deprecation, that can often help to de-escalate. So humor can be a good thing. It's just a matter of how you're positioning it and who the target is. So Angela, you're saying offer a meeting in person. Okay. And so let's continue a few more. So that's an idea. Danny, you're saying take some time to think about it. Jeffrey, you said I would quote Senator Everett Dirksen, who said we must all rise above principle. Heather, you're saying document support point of view and claim, use law, precedent, regulations to support the factual basis. Okay, all good responses. Let's map it out here. So if we're looking for signals of differing views, the tripwire, if you go back to what the examples were in the tripwire, so you have the repetition. So they're reiterating their position. Things are starting to slow down. So that engagement is decreasing. That's a tripwire. Then you have the change in tone, a new demand. There's the shift. So tension, you're starting to see some tension, but that is definite tension. When you see a change in tone, that's the flashpoint. That's where you can intervene. The ultimatum, obviously, that's moving towards a detonator. So flashpoint is change in tone of the negotiation. Intervene could be any of the ones that you mentioned. Again, you wanted to redirect. So it could be, hey, why don't we set up time to take a step back and refocus on what we're wanting to accomplish? Absolutely. But again, you wanted to change direction, not let it continue to escalate. So great call outs. So I've walked you through the pathway and the various components on the pathway and what to do about it. Take a look. Some others came in there, so thanks, Suresh. So take a leader position flashpoint. So what can you do what can help to enhance how you handle escalation and those suggestions that were made about do you redirect? Do you just adjust? Do you try to maintain leverage or do you contain? So what can help enhance that? What I'll share with you is the executives, board members, attorneys who are able to navigate that pathway very well have discovered and utilized a few things that help them not only prior to escalation, but also during escalation. Remember, escalation often will happen in real time. It's great if you have lead time, but often it happens in real time. So there are some key essentials that the people who are doing it really well were using. The first thing that these individuals would do is they would take into consideration the type of the situation and the severity of it, including who's in it, basically who are the stakeholders, who can influence and who can impact it, and how do they do so. So that's really, if I'm going to sum it up in a nutshell, that's really about reading the situation and the stakeholders. So that's step number one. The second thing they would often do is take into consideration, okay, what are they bringing into that scenario that can help them, potential strength, as well as some things that can possibly get in their way or hinder them. So there could be limitations. And then they would use that to determine, okay, this is what can help, this is what can hurt. How can I combine that with what I know about the stakeholders and the situation in terms of severity and the players in it? Those two combined to determine what are approaches that are more likely to produce the outcome that I'm seeking. So first thing was read the situation of the stakeholders. The second thing where they're considering strengths and limitations that they're bringing into it was kind of leveraging their own self-awareness and some self-regulation there as well. Those combined, they were looking at what are approaches I can use that are more likely to produce the outcome that I'm looking for. That's really more about anticipating the impact of the approaches they came up with. The last thing that the board members, executives, and attorneys who handle the pathway really well and navigate it really well, including escalation in different forms, is that they would consider, well, how am I showing up? Given those three things I just mentioned, okay, I know who the players are, I know the severity of the situation, I know I've recognized, is this potentially a tripwire, or is this just signal, or is this a flashpoint, or potentially about to cross the threshold and detonate? I know the situation, know the players, I understand what I'm bringing as a strength. I maybe be a little impatient, so I got to manage my stuff pretty well. So I'm going to choose this particular approach and redirect as my approach. But how I do that, how I show up as I'm redirecting is just as important. So the last point is they're considering how soft do I approach? What type is it, more of a velvet glove type of an approach, or is it more of a more assertive, maybe more direct approach, or something in between those two, so that I can try to de-escalate or stay in the front part of the pathway versus the latter part. As I shared those examples of what to do, the language and the uh, directness that you would use would go from soft, starting with preserve, and then as you move to adjust, as you move to redirect, and as you move to contain. As you move further down to contain, then you would become more direct. So softer at the front end, more direct at the back end. So these attorneys, board members, uh, directors, executives, they are taking the time to consider, all right, what am I bringing in? Who are the players? Severity of the situation. Here are approaches I can take. How am I going to show up? Okay, if I'm going to use a softer approach, then it looks like more of what I might use at the preserve stage versus the detonator stage. So those are key things just to kind of keep in mind as we're wanting to try to get better at enhancing and using that escalation pathway in a more productive way. So the other thing I want to share with you is the time horizon. So the scenarios that I shared with you, obviously I made them really short for the sake of this discussion for this webinar. But it can give the impression that the various points in the pathway are happening right after the other in a contiguous way. They're immediate one after the other. They can happen that way. That is true. And in some cases, they happen right on top of each other. And you may not be able to distinguish, okay, is this really a tripwire or is this a flashpoint? But if you think about it, you'll be able to determine the difference because of the tension and the shift. In other cases, it is more spread out. So what I want to help you think through is how time can be of value to you. So as you get more comfortable using the pathway, you can broaden your time horizon and start to identify the various points in the pathway sooner. So let me give you an example here. Pardon me. I'm going to give you an example from my world so you can see. So I was brought in to work with an executive team to help them become a more high-performing executive team. So I'll give you just brief context and background on this. I won't show the name of the company or the individuals, obviously, for confidentiality's sake. But in this particular case, it was a team that was rebuilding. We had met, been working together for 5 months. We met, identified what the challenges were. We mapped out what the action plan was. And then we talked through what our metrics we're going to use to gauge progress. So my role was to partner with them to help them become a more high-performing team. Also to hold them accountable and help hold them each other accountable as we did this. So that's the context. So how I went about doing that, I would meet with the members of the executive team one-on-one on a monthly basis, and then I would meet with the team as a whole on a quarterly basis at one of their executive team meetings throughout the country. So 5 months had transpired. The next executive team meeting was a day and a half away. I get a call, and I noticed by the caller ID it was one of the executive team members. Now, I told the executive team members that they could reach out to me at any point in time. They never did, usually because they would make an appointment, schedule it, or they just wait until we talk one-on-one or wait until the executive team meeting. So in this case, the call out of the blue was potentially a signal. Remember what I said a signal was. Signal is a difference. It can be difference in perspective, priorities, the way things are interpreted. Signal can also be a difference in behavior. So I want to make that distinction here. So in this case, it was potential signal. And I knew from working with this team over 5 months that they had a tendency to get a little heated and a little volatile. So I had that history to draw from as well. So The fact that it called out of the blue, I'm like, okay, signal, difference. Pick up the phone. I'm just going to call the gentleman Bill. It wasn't his real name, but I referred to him as Bill. So I could tell by Bill's tone of voice that he was irritated. So tone. So I'm like thinking, okay, signal, or is this potentially a tripwire? Tone. So I said, hi Bill, what's going on? And then he just launched into it. The the financials for last quarter just came out, and they're awful. The executive team is not following through on its commitments, and it's all your fault. So I'm giving you the PG version. It was at a much higher volume. There are a few more F-bombs and expletives. So at this point, it caught me off guard. And so I realized, okay, no longer signal here. If I'm taking a step back, applying the framework or the pathway, the fact that it shifted from the issue of the financials to the executive team to me, shift from issue to person, that might indicate it's a tripwire. However, because of the heat at which he was coming at me, it was clearly a flashpoint. So tension, heat, accusatory, actually adversarial. So it was definitely a flashpoint. So as I was looking back and working with this gentleman, I also knew that he had a tendency to be volatile. I'd seen it in other executive team meetings. I've seen it in board meetings as well. So my approach here was not to respond in kind. As I pointed out, that was one of the common mistakes people made. As tempting as it might have been, was not to respond in kind. The approach here was to redirect. So I said, okay, Bill, I understand. So let's take a step back. If the executive team is not following through on its commitments, then I need to understand why. After I said that, that backed him off a little bit and said, okay, you're right. It's not you, it's us as a team. And so I continued, the conversation you and I have between the two of us should not be just the two of us. It should be with the entire team. So let's wait a day and a half and let's have this conversation with the entire team. And so he said, fine, and he hung up, and that ended the call. So saw that there was some signal, the signal's behavior, chance it could have been a tripwire, but in fact ended up being a flashpoint. Now I realized, okay, I've got an executive team meeting with this group. I don't know what I'm walking into. I just saw some heat and some flashpoints here. I could be walking into that in the executive team meeting too. I did not have enough lead time to reach out to the other executive team members to get a sense of where they're at. If they are looking at the poor or terrible financials, they might be reacting the same way as he is. So I could be walking into a detonator, and they could very easily turn their sights on me, and I could be the scapegoat since Bill was saying it's all your fault. Others may be saying the same thing too. Even though that's not why I was brought in, I had nothing to do with their financials. They had a strong CFO, they had a strong finance team, and they had agreed as an executive team to help each other out. If they noticed something was off, they would step in and back each other up. So clearly something happened and somebody missed something. So my challenge at this point was figuring out what's the strategy I'm going to use in this meeting, given that I saw a signal, I saw a flashpoint, and I saw potentially tripwire, but definitely a flashpoint. Normally I could call them out directly, and they would take it the right way. Because I built enough of a rapport over the 5 months, I could do that, and I knew it was coming from the right place. I wasn't trying to challenge them or lead with ego or pride. It was just because that was the right thing to do to get the issues on the table. I wasn't sure that was the best approach to take here because of the volatility I saw in that call, because of the flashpoint. So I decided to wait until I got in the meeting to see what I could see. So day and a half later, when I walked into the meeting room, now, what you typically see when you walk into one of their executive team meetings, you see them chit-chatting about what they did last weekend, the restaurant they went to, maybe about their sports team. So they'd be engaging each other left and right. There was none of that. I also noticed as I walked in, yes, they said hi to me, but it was really more an acknowledgement of my presence versus engaging me. So both of those could potentially be signal or maybe tripwire. I also noticed that one person did try to engage someone else in conversation. It was very brief and abrupt. So signal, tripwire, question mark. And then the other thing I noticed was that they were all sitting very rigid in their chairs. Like, okay, all right, more signal, potential tripwire. So if I looked at any one of those in isolation, individually, I could have maybe said, all right, that's just signal, or maybe a tripwire. But if I looked at them in combination, because of the experience and history I had with them, I'm like, okay, it's neither one of those. It's a flashpoint. There's tension in the room. I can definitely sense the tension in the room. The way they're sitting in the chairs, the way they really didn't engage each other, the way they didn't engage me really at all, the way they were not chit-chatting all, there's tension in the room. So this is a flashpoint. So how do I proceed forward here? So going direct at them, bad idea. Detonator would probably happen pretty quick. So I went with a redirect and an indirect approach. So I decided to let's have them call themselves out and I'll just reinforce it. So I laid out, okay, executive team, let's just use a progression here. I'm going to draw something up on the whiteboard here. We got team A, we got team B, team C. Team A is a collection of individuals. It's not a team. It's just a collection of individuals. Team B is really more of a working group. They get things done, but they're doing the bare minimum. Team C is really a high performing team. They hold each other mutually accountable. They have each other's back. They can have heated discussions, but they're productive. They don't personalize them. So let me ask you, executive team, where do you see yourselves on this continuum? And so I was waiting for someone to speak up so that I could then reinforce what it was I was hearing. And so Bill spoke up. So I'm like, okay, here's the moment of truth. Is Bill going to throw me under the bus, or is Bill going to reinforce what we were talking about? Because as I mentioned before, Bill had a tendency to be volatile and he would throw people under the bus. I'd seen it happen in the past. So as I was waiting for that to happen, Bill finally said, I see us as somewhere between A and B. So the collection of individuals and the work group. Like, okay, what about the rest of you? And they all chimed in and they agreed. So we then could get into the conversation of, okay, you guys committed to this. What happened so that we can continue on this path to become a high performing team? So it was a redirect. The reason I'm pointing that out using that example is it isn't always obvious immediately what you're seeing, but time can help you. The more comfortable you get looking at these various or using these various points in the pathway, what's a signal, what's a tripwire, what's a flashpoint, what's a detonator, the easier it will be for you to spot them. And you can broaden your time horizon and see where you can identify them sooner and intervene sooner. And that's what benefited me in this particular situation, because I had the history with them. I knew that the signal was the behavior change in the call. Like, that's unusual. And then when I heard the tone, like, okay, potential tripwire, and then it obviously became a flashpoint. Same thing in the meeting too. So that's what I want to encourage you to do is to, when you get off the call, go apply some of these things. This is meant to be applied, not just talked about. So let me ask you the next question here. So think about a situation in your own work. Where did you see escalation actually start versus becoming visible? If you think back, what was the situation? Again, if you want to put into the Q&A area, genericize it. I don't want you to give it anything way that's confidential or proprietary. But where did it actually start versus where was it obvious or noticeable or visible? Anybody, just to share, think for a minute or so and put it into the Q&A section. And I'll answer some of the other questions as you do that. Let me talk to one as you're filling this out. So, Joy, you talked about if opposing counsel is escalating intentionally. That happens. no doubt, escalation can be a strategy. So the question becomes, do you want to engage in that strategy, or do you want to find a way to de-escalate? Is it a flashpoint? Is it a detonator? Do you redirect? Do you contain? And if it's a detonator, then in that case, time helps you, as does taking the person out of it. So you don't want to add fuel to the fire. You don't want to continue to make it about each other. You want to reorient it back towards the issue if possible. I'm going to look at Heather's here. One side's in ultimate outcome may be reasonable because they're not really committed to a fair outcome. Divergent views, willingness to compromise will affect the outcome. That can be true. So are you seeing that if that is a sounds probably more along the lines of a tripwire flashpoint. So that divergent views signal. So what could you do to try to get them to get a better understanding of your perspective and focus it more on the outcome that is maybe not fair in your perspective, but getting it a better understanding what is fair from their perspective. So that sounds like it could have been explored earlier on at the signal stage. So I'd be curious to hear more about that. Let me go back to my question though. Where do you see define tripwire, please? Sometimes tripwire is intends to bring in quick closure to a dispute or to maintain status quo. A tripwire is, again, let me make the distinction between the three. The signal is just there's a difference. Tripwire is where escalation is starting. And that's true. It can be intended to bring closure. You want some tension up to a point can help you to focus and to bring clarity and to get to that. That is true. But it's a matter of how much do you add. Up to an optimal point, tension can help you. But when you start to get to that point or that decision moment where tension is reached that heat level to where if you add more, it's more than likely going to set the person off and put you over that threshold. That's where it starts to work against you. So fine, by all means, use the tension to your advantage, but just know about, keep in mind what is you're trying to accomplish and know when too much is going to take it down the path of being destructive. The things that will help you to determine that are the amount of emotion you're seeing in the situation, the amount of the tone that they're using, the word choice, and body language that will help you determine am I getting closer to that detonator stage. Maybe one part is going alone before emailing about it. I'm not sure what that's in reference to. In film production, lining up the placement beforehand is two-stepping immediately upon someone else being fired. Okay. Maybe one party going, all right. All right, okay. So maybe one party going alone before emailing about it. That's, I'm assuming, where it's escalation. In film production, lining up the replacement beforehand to stepping immediately upon someone else being fired. Okay, all right. So that's where it's escalation started. Okay, fair enough. And then someone being fired, it's visible. All right. I remember a time with a senior attorney. Escalation started when expectations misaligned. Okay. Escalation became visible when paralegal ignored instructions. Okay. All right. Let me move us to the sort of towards the end here. So key takeaways here. Conflict starts with differences. Differences are not bad, they're neutral. How differences are handled is what drives the escalation. So it's not just a difference, it's how they're handled. The flashpoint is the decision moment that we've mentioned a few times. So that's where you really want to redirect before it moves to the next one, which is detonator. The detonator is where the impact is really impact as well as the risk is extending beyond the immediate matter at hand. Last thing in terms of civility, this is where civility helps you. So civility, as I'm defining it here, civility is not just about tone. Civility includes tone, and tone can be conveyed in a couple ways. Word choice can convey tone, no doubt, but also so does voice. Pitch, volume, cadence, that can convey tone as well as body language. So it's tone plus judgment and control as pressure increases. And control in this context is how is that misalignment being handled and what is it leading to? So it's the combination of those three that I'm defining as civility: tone plus judgment plus control under pressure. So I'm going to open up to questions from you all. If I know we're at the top of the hour, if you have a few more, I'm happy to stay on a little longer. If you have additional questions or want more information, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to chat with you. So, of course, you're welcome, Lita. How did I avoid feeling like it was your fault the team didn't perform? Great question, Jay. I will be honest, the conscience did kick in a little bit, but as I mentioned, my role was not to fix their financials. So as we talked it through, uh, it was about the team had missed something. They all agreed that if they saw something was off, that they would reach out to whoever was the person over that part of the company, and they just hadn't done that. So where I felt a little bit of my conscience kicking in there is, okay, why didn't you guys bring this up, or how could I have elicited more of a discussion with them faster? Or why didn't we address the issue that there clearly should have been signs, because financials are typically a lagging indicator. There should have been signs that could have been identified by somebody. Why didn't it happen? So that's kind of where my conscience kicked in a little bit. Is okay, did we not get into enough detail in a meeting? But I'll tell you in that meeting, after we kind of cleared the air and we redirected it to focus on what the team was wanting to accomplish, the dialogue became much more candid, much more open. So even though it was at a flashpoint, approaching a detonator, when we redirected, they were much more candid because of what they had experienced with the financials. And everybody's like, okay, we're all in this together. How are we going to dig out now? There's no point in pointing fingers. We got to dig out of it. And that's kind of what helped them to kind of become much more collaborative, including with me. So great question, Jay. Any other questions?
All right, it looks like that's it for questions. Thank you so much, Ryan, for an excellent presentation. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.